Welcome to Face the Jury. Thank you for joining me today to talk about medical malpractice, what it is, how to spot it, and how to protect you and your families from being victims. Today we're going to talk about one of the most significant medical malpractice trials I've ever been involved in. This is the case of Sandra Williams versus St. Francis Hospital. In this case, we represented Sandy Williams. She was about 53 years old at the time, and we represented Sandy for claims of medical malpractice that resulted after she had developed a post-surgical complication following neck surgery. A little bit of background about Sandy leading up to her surgery. Sandy, at the time of all this, was about 53 years old. She worked at a local bank in the trust department, and she was married to Philip Williams, had two grown boys, both work and live in the community of Columbus, Georgia. Sandy had a degenerative condition in her neck. In other words, she had a condition in her neck that's common with people who, as they age, where their neck and the spinal cord, the area surrounding the spinal cord, becomes a little bit compressed and can pinch on nerves and can cause pain. And Sandy had some chronic pain that was bothering her. So she went to her doctor to be evaluated. And the doctor tried some conservative things at first and decided that she would likely benefit from a neck fusion surgery. This is a type of surgery that's been around for many, many years, decades. And it's a surgery where the doctor goes in through the front of the neck to access the spinal column and then goes in, pushes all the windpipe and the muscles and things out of the way, and goes in with some tools to clean out the bone and to release pressure on the nerve roots and to hopefully release the pain. Sandy trusted her doctor. He was very well credentialed. He had done many of these surgeries over his 3 decades of practice. So she felt confident that this was the right way to go. The surgery proceeds as expected, and she comes out of the surgery in the recovery room, and she's doing pretty well. She's got some soreness in her throat, of course, which is common, but the surgery has been successful. A few days later, Sandy is released from the hospital to go home and to begin her recovery. Well, a couple of days after Sandy was released from the hospital, she had a progressively worsening ability to swallow. In other words, she was having more and more trouble swallowing anything, including her own saliva. And she and her husband, Philip, got worried. And Philip called the on-call service, surgery service, to talk to the doctor. And he was patched through to a Dr. Westerlund, Eric Westerlund, who was a surgeon that was partners with the actual surgeon who did the process. But he was on call that night. Dr. Westerlund listened to Philip explain that his wife couldn't swallow, and he was getting worried about her. He was afraid she was becoming dehydrated. And Dr. Westerlund said, well, if she gets worse, you can take her to the emergency department in the morning. But in the meantime, have her suck on a popsicle to try and get some liquid down her throat. So Philip hangs up the phone. It's about 2 a.m. He looks over to Sandy and says, honey, you're not getting any better. You can't sleep. Let's just get dressed and go on to the hospital. And that's what they did. They drove on to the emergency department at St. Francis Hospital. When they get to the hospital, Sandy is checked through the triage area, and she and Philip explain the problem she's having, that she can't swallow. Her neck is noted to be swollen. She's got pain in her neck. She has gurgling when she tries to swallow, sort of a gurgling sound. And the emergency room doctor, he does the right thing. He orders x-rays of her neck to see what's going on, possibly to explain her swollen neck and her symptoms. He takes the x-ray, and the x-ray shows a large mass, a large sort of area of swelling that's pushing on her windpipe or her trachea, and is pushing her windpipe forward and to the side. The ER doctor calls Dr. Westerlund at home and tells him about his patient that's in the emergency room and the condition she's in. Dr. Westerland says, well, go ahead and admit her to the intensive care unit. He identifies her as critical condition and says, I'll be in to see her later. Well, later doesn't come for the next hour, or the next hour, or the next hour, or the next hour. And almost 5.5 to 6 hours go by before Dr. Westerland ever comes to the bedside of Sandy to see how she's doing and to assess her condition and see what needs to be done. And by the time he gets to Sandy's bedside, this mass in her neck has expanded to a point where it's compressing her airway, her windpipe, and twisting it where it's almost shut. There's literally a slit of breathing space for her to get air. But she's still, what they say, is fully saturated. She's close to 100% oxygen. She's doing okay, in terms of her oxygen levels. Dr. Westerland calls for a pulmonology consult, which is a pulmonologist, is a doctor who specializes in breathing the airway and the lungs. The pulmonologist comes to the bedside within a short period of time, and they decide that Sandy needs to be intubated. And that just means have a tube put down her windpipe and have a machine where she can get air and protect her airway if it completely collapses. Well, they try to put this tube down her windpipe, but her windpipe is so twisted and distorted that the tube won't go down. If you imagine a cardboard paper towel holder, a dispenser, and imagine it being squeezed and twisted, you would imagine, you can't imagine what Sandy's windpipe looked like. So they begin this intubation. They can't get the tube down. At this point, the complete airway has collapsed, and Sandy is unconscious. Her eyes are closed. A nurse notes that Sandy's fingers are turning blue. Her toes are blue. Her lips are blue. She's becoming what's called cyanotic, which means she's not getting enough oxygen, and she is being suffocated slowly because her airway is shut down. Dr. Westerland opens up her neck at the bedside where the incision was from the previous surgery, and he sticks his 2 fingers into the open hole, and he scoops out globs of red, congealed, jelly-like hematoma or blood clot. And he's pulling this, literally scooping this clot out of her neck, trying to release the pressure on her airway. Sandy is in extreme trouble. He tries to get the airway back open. He can't do it. They call for an anesthesiologist who's on call to come in and help. Anesthesiologists are the real experts in managing a patient's airway. The only problem was the anesthesiologist was downtown at the gym having a workout. And by the time he gets a tube placed down Sandy's windpipe, she has been without oxygen for at least 20 minutes. And she does not wake up for approximately 30 days. When she does wake up, Sandy is blind. She has what's called anoxic brain injury, which is a brain injury resulting from lack of oxygen. It's a diffuse injury, meaning it spans different parts of her brain. It's not one discrete focal part of her brain. It's the damages throughout her brain. And her husband, Philip, who has been by her side at every step of this process, is relieved when she finally wakes up. Philip realized that this was going to be a long, long road for recovery for his wife. Fortunately, we have the finest, or one of the finest, rehabilitation hospitals in Georgia. And Philip talked with Sandy's doctors and managed to get her transferred to the Shepherd Center in Atlanta, which again is one of the finest hospitals. And there's no place better to be if a patient is facing a catastrophic outcome, such as Sandy was in this case. So they started down this pathway, and Sandy was transferred up to Atlanta. And over the next 2 to 3 months, they put Sandy through rigorous physical recovery and rehabilitation. All of these things Sandy went through for a number of months until she recovered as much as she could from the Shepherd help. Sandy was discharged back to her home in Columbus, and she picked up additional rehabilitation back in Columbus and has made remarkable progress. Of course, her vision never came back, but she did learn to walk with assistance. She has lost her ability to control her balance, so she can't walk unsupported, but she can move her legs and support herself. But she's essentially confined to a wheelchair. This was the story of Philip and Sandy before I met them. Philip was completely 100% focused on Sandy's recovery and was with her at every step of the way, rehab and the doctor's appointments and the follow-up appointments. But as the 2-year anniversary approached, Philip realized that if there was any medical malpractice here, that he would have to bring the claim within that 2-year anniversary, or else he would not be able to ever bring it again. And he didn't know if there was a claim. He didn't know if there was malpractice. But what he was concerned about is that he realized this was going to be Sandy's condition for the rest of her life. She would always need help. She would always need assistance with basic activities of daily living, like bathing and cooking and cleaning. And Philip was concerned about that he's not always going to be around. And he decided to talk to a local attorney in Columbus. Unfortunately, it was about a week and a half before the statute of limitations passed, and the attorney in Columbus called up one of my colleagues in Atlanta, Dr. Larry Schlachter, who is a neurosurgeon and is also a lawyer. And we do a lot of work together, a lot of cases together, and have for years. And the attorney in Columbus, his name's Andy Dodgen, he's an excellent attorney. He's also a local municipal court judge, calls up Larry and says, I just met this wonderful lady, and she has told me a little bit about her story, and we've got a statute of limitations issue. The 2-year anniversary is coming up in a week and a half. And Larry kind of took a gulp, and then he said, well, let me call you back. And Larry calls me, tells me what he had learned about this case. And he says, I don't know if there's a case or not, but we better figure it out fast, or we're not going to be able to protect this lady's right to bring a lawsuit if there was, in fact, malpractice. So that's what happened. Larry and I made an appointment for Sandy and Philip to come see us. And I think they were up there maybe the next day or the following day, but it was quick. And we met Sandy and Philip and frankly just fell in love with them. They're just wonderful people. Philip is sort of a big, heavy-set guy, kind of a strong, broad guy, and showed such tenderness with Sandy as he would help her out of the car. When he would got her back in the car at the end of the appointment, he strap her in with the seatbelt and just very tender and very committed to her. And that impressed Larry and me. We didn't know at the end of that meeting if there was malpractice, but we began to suspect there was. This was a horrible outcome for what was a routine surgery, an elective procedure. And we suspected that somebody somewhere had dropped the ball. But we just didn't know where. So we got the medical records very quickly. And this is part of the benefit of having a close colleague who's a neurosurgeon. He was able to get into the records, and very short period of time, he calls me up. And he says, there's a case. And I said, well, what's the case? And he said, they did not come in and take care of her. When she showed up at the emergency department, they had all the information they needed to realize that this could go very badly, very quick if they did not take care of her. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, she had a hematoma in her neck. And a hematoma is a collection of blood products that can develop after surgery. Some people get them, some people don't. But if you get it and this thing is expanding, it can be really, really dangerous because in the front of the neck, it can squeeze your air pipe, your windpipe, and suffocate you. And Larry and I talked about it, and he said the records show that the on-call physician knew that Sandy Williams was in the hospital. He knew she had a swollen neck. She couldn't swallow saliva. She was in pain. And he waited almost 6 hours to come and see her. And there's no excuse for that. He should have gotten in there quickly. He should have assessed her, and he should have protected her airway and taken out this big hematoma. And he didn't do that. And we still don't know what took him so long to get there, but we do know that he didn't get there in time to help her. And by the time he got there, she was on the brink of a cliff, and he frankly pushed her over. And all of this was preventable, 100% preventable, if he had gotten out of bed, gotten in his car, and come in to see her. And he didn't do that. So we knew we had a case, and this was a righteous case, and we were working under a tight timetable, but you do what you got to do. We had some late nights. We prioritized this case over every other case we had, because we had to with the statute approaching, and we got the case filed with a few days to spare. So this was a case with lots of twists and turns. We had filed the suit against a number of the medical providers who had been involved in Sandy's care. We weren't 100% sure who had primary responsibility, but in Georgia, you have to identify and file suit against all the medical providers who may be responsible, because we have apportionment, and if we don't do that, then it can be harmful to the client. So we filed the lawsuit. There were a number of lawyers involved, and then we get into the discovery phase, and this is where you learn about the case beyond what the medical records reveal. In medical malpractice cases, so much of the case is what's inside the medical records, but we always make a point of going behind the medical records and beyond the medical records to really understand why things happen. We can see what time doctors did what time nurses did their activities, but it's very important to understand why they did things the way they did them. So we get into discovery, and one of the key issues is, where's Dr. Westerland? And there was a dispute about that. Dr. Westerland testified at his deposition that he had shown up at the hospital on the morning of Sandy's admission, and he had been in the hospital but just didn't come by to see her for a number of hours. Well, we didn't really believe that was the case. If you're at the hospital, you've got a patient you've admitted into the ICU, why wouldn't you go by and see her yourself? You have a responsibility to do that. But he didn't do it. But he did claim that he was at the hospital. He testified that when he showed up at the hospital that morning, he had pulled up Sandy's x-rays that had been taken in the emergency department a few hours earlier and had reviewed them. And based on his review of the x-rays, he did not see anything concerning. And that gave him confidence that he could take care of other business and other patients in the hospital and wait to see Sandy. Well, we decided we needed to investigate that and see what the truth was. So in these medical records, when you have radiology images, x-rays, CTs, that type of thing, those are all stored electronically in what's called a PACS system, which is just a big database where these electronic images are stored. And anytime somebody goes into the PACS system to look at an image, the computer keeps track of that. And then the computer can create something called an audit trail, which documents when a imaging study was opened, who opened it, how long it was opened, where in the hospital it was opened. In other words, what computer terminal was used to access it, and provide some other information as well, specifically what was opened. So we decided to request the audit trail and see who had accessed these images and confirm whether or not Dr. Westerland truly had gone into the PACS system to look at these images. And what we learned was that he had not accessed these images. In fact, he had never looked at Sandy's x-rays until the day she was transferred from St. Francis Hospital up to the Shepherd Center in Atlanta. And at that point, he was, of course, not involved in her care at all. He was no longer her treating physician. But he did not look at him the day that he claimed he did, according to the audit trails. Now, we asked him about this at the jury trial, and Dr. Westerland claimed, there must have been something wrong with the computer. Well, that's not very credible when the audit trail it correctly documents what's in the, who looked at the images based on other medical records. It's not very credible to say, well, it must have just had a glitch when I accessed them. But that wasn't the only thing that sort of developed in the discovery phase. We had some I'll be charitable and just call it some misunderstandings with defense counsel in this case about some of the evidence. We asked the defense to provide an audit trail documenting all of the patients that Dr. Westerlin had interacted with, because we didn't really believe that he had been in the hospital like he had claimed. At first, they said they couldn't produce an audit trail. They could only produce it for patients, but they could not produce it for physicians. Well, we pressed them on this because that didn't make sense. We knew that wasn't true. And they kind of backed off and said, well, we'll produce it to you, which they did. They produced the audit trail for Dr. Westerlin. And the audit trail had a number of entries that were redacted. So when the document was produced to me in discovery, there were black bars obscuring some of the data. I looked at this and I consulted with another attorney who was working with us on the case, an excellent attorney in Macon, Georgia, named Joel Greist. And I showed this to Joel and we discussed it. And Joel said, there's something funny about this document. I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, those bars, those redactions are not flattened into the document. You can actually see what's beneath these blackened bars. And I took a look, and there was a number of data entries specifically about Sandy Williams. Well, of course, I'm entitled to see exactly any information about my client. And so that should not have been redacted. And it became clear to me why they redacted it, because they were trying to obscure what Dr. Westerlin was doing and where he was in the hospital. So this wasn't okay for me. You provide evidence, you don't black out relevant information. So I emailed the attorney, the defense lawyer, and I said, what specifically did y'all black out or redact? He responded, well, it had nothing to do with Sandy Williams. And I had him confirm that a second time. I said, can you confirm that none of the information that's been blacked out is related to Sandy Williams? And he confirmed with another email and said, no, it has nothing to do with Sandy Williams. Well, at that point, I felt like it was pretty clear we're just getting jerked around and not getting treated as the rules of evidence and procedure require, which is with honesty and candor. We filed a motion with the court, and we asked the court to strike the answer of the hospital, for playing these kind of shady discovery games. And the judge that was presiding at that time had a hearing and sort of took it under advisement, didn't give us the relief we were looking for, gave us other relief, said we could bring this up in trial in front of a jury. The issue didn't really go further than that. But the best thing is we got the information that we were entitled to, and the case just kept plowing forward. All these cases, and Sandy Williams was no exception, they are more of a siege than an ambush. It takes focused work, diligent work. It's highly detailed work because the defense are highly motivated to, of course, do their job, the defense lawyers, which is to try to protect their clients as best they can within the boundaries of the rules of evidence. But this was an example, though, I think, of the defense pushing the boundaries beyond where they should be and trying to hide evidence from us. And with our team, we were able to discover this and reveal it and press the case forward. So the discovery in this case lasted about maybe a year and a half. Everybody in the case pretty much got deposed, the doctor, the radiologist. There was a large number of depositions, large amount of discovery that took place. All of this focused on getting to trial. That's the goal. That's our goal when we take on one of these cases, is to move it forward to get to trial as quickly as possible. And we had a change in judge. The new judge that came in was Judge Richardson, who's a very experienced, highly regarded judge in Muskogee County, which is where Columbus is. And Judge Richardson set us down for trial and gave us a firm trial date. And I remember the conversation I had with my co-counsel that this case will never go to trial. I did not believe that the defense would allow this case to go to trial because what we had discovered through the discovery process and depositions just pointed to overwhelming evidence of liability as I saw it. It was clear Dr. Westerlin had not come to see his patient. There was actually a written policy that required an admitting physician to come see the patient within 2 hours of admission into the ICU. It didn't do it. So I had a high degree of suspicion that we would ever get to present the case in front of a jury. I figured as we got closer and closer to trial, the defense would offer enough money that it would be the right thing to do to settle the case. But that didn't happen. We show up for the first day of trial. We go through the jury selection process, which is called voir dire. And this is one of the most important parts of a jury trial. This is the time where the lawyer gets to interact directly with the jury and have conversations with these folks and get to know them somewhat. Of course, there's limitations because you don't have all the time in the world. But Judge Richardson gave us an opportunity to have a thorough jury selection process. And frankly, we liked very much what we saw. The people that showed up for jury selection were drawn from all different walks of the community, all different types of backgrounds, different ethnicities, races, socioeconomic class, all those things, just what you would hope from a jury, a diverse cross-section of the community. And we got to know them, and we made our selections. And at the end of the day, we were very pleased with the people who were seated at the jury. It was very reflective of the community. And more importantly, the values of the panel members that we had been able to learn through the jury selection process seemed to align with the values of Sandy and her husband, Philip. Sandy and Philip were natives of Columbus. They belonged to a church in the community. They had been active in the church for many years, and it was a major part of their life. And the people on the jury reflected some of those values. And we just seemed like we were in good shape. My co-counsel told me that looking at this jury and having the chance to get to know who they were, do you think this case is going to continue to go forward or is it going to settle? And I turned to my co-counsel and I said, we're trying this case all the way through, and unless the defense gives us a reason not to. In other words, unless they get serious and decide to pay what the case is worth. And it's worth a lot because there was a lot of harm in the case. And there were some informal discussions as the trial began. The defense offered $5 million, which sounds like a lot of money, except you're talking about damages to a person that are going to exist for 30 more years. You're talking about blindness. You're talking about loss of function, loss of mobility, confinement to a wheelchair. And I didn't laugh at him. I politely declined, though, after talking to my client, and said, that's ridiculous. So he kind of moved on, and the case starts. The choice of your first witness in any trial, really, but particularly in a medical malpractice case, is a very important decision. And there are a lot of schools of thought on who you should call first as a witness. Some people believe that you should call the defendant first and put them right on the spot and go right at them and establish your case or not. But right out of the box, call the defendant. Other people think, well, you shouldn't do that. You should call neutral, sort of third-party type witnesses who maybe have higher credibility. So there are just different ways to approach it. We decided to approach it a little differently. Instead of calling the actual defendant in the case, which at this point was St. Francis Hospital because of their employee, Dr. Westerland, we decided to call the actual surgeon who did the procedure, the partner of Dr. Westerland. His name was Dr. Walsh. And I don't know how many folks out there remember Marcus Welby, the old TV show from the 70s. If you can imagine Marcus Welby, white hair, sort of with a stethoscope around his neck, kind of the prototypical TV physician. That's how I would describe Dr. Walsh. Big head of white hair, very experienced surgeon, been in the community a long time. His wife was the chief medical officer of St. Francis Hospital, and she was also a physician, orthopedic surgeon, I believe. So very strong medical family. Well, we call Dr. Walsh. And not surprisingly, Dr. Walsh was very supportive of his partner. And he said that his partner did everything exactly right. And Dr. Walsh said that his partner, Dr. Westerland, did not have to come see Sandy any earlier than he did, since she was not showing any breathing problems until many hours after she arrived at the emergency department, there was nothing to do other than serially observe her. In other words, just watch and wait. And as soon as she starts having breathing problems, that's when you consider surgery to possibly take out this hematoma. Dr. Walsh testified that that's the right way to treat these patients, that this is the standard of care, and you serially observe them until they start having breathing problems. Well, what Dr. Walsh didn't realize is that we had discovered that Dr. Walsh had been an expert witness in a case a couple of years earlier, and he had been hired as an expert witness in a different case involving a plaintiff who had had a neck surgery, who developed a hematoma, who came back to the emergency room a few days after discharge without any breathing problems, but having a hard time swallowing their saliva, and had a swollen neck and had pain. Almost an identical scenario to Sandy Williams. Next week, I'll tell you about the doctor's testimony in that previous case and how I used it in my case with Sandy. Please join us for the conclusion to this story next week on Face the Jury. Face the Jury is produced by Lloyd Bell and Adam Kincaid, executive producer Lauren Shankman, and audio engineer Joel Edwards. I'm your host, Lloyd Bell. Join us, as always, next week on Face the Jury.